Secrets of Foxglove Hall at Christmas. A Miss Marple mystery. The snow had begun to fall heavier now, a fine powder dusting the ground and muffling the sound of footsteps as Miss Marple made her way along the path to Foxglove Hall. The Christmas decorations on the old estate looked almost too perfect, an image straight out of a holiday postcard. Yet, despite the festive cheer, something about the grand house didn't feel quite right. The air was heavy with secrets, and the tall windows stared down at her, dark and uninviting. She had arrived just after dusk, when the long shadows stretched over the sprawling grounds and the house seemed to whisper its mysteries. For all its grandeur, the hall had a coldness to it, a chill that reached beyond the winter wind. Inside, she was greeted by Mrs. Dalloway, the housekeeper, who seemed more concerned with the guests than the season's festivities. "There's been a bit of a stir, Miss Marple," Mrs. Dalloway had whispered as she ushered her inside. "It's not just the holiday spirit that's unsettling the family." As the door closed behind them, the warmth of the fire in the hall seemed to cut through the chill that had clung to Miss Marple's coat. The room was filled with a dozen people, most of whom appeared to be in varying degrees of discomfort. The manor was hosting a Christmas gathering, but the usual cheer seemed absent. Instead, there was an air of forced politeness, a tension that lingered despite the laughter and small talk. Miss Marple's eyes moved over the guests. She could already see the web of relationships, the subtle shifts in body language, the way people glanced at each other, and the way some avoided eye contact entirely. Her mind was quick to take stock of the dynamics. The sharp-eyed Lord Foxglove, his usually stern demeanor softened only slightly by the holiday season. His daughter, Miss Juliet Foxglove, standing by the fire, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her eyes darting between her father and the others. And then there was Edward Faulkner, the family lawyer, whose every gesture seemed to be calculated, as though he were watching the room from behind his glasses. Despite the cheer of the evening, Miss Marple couldn't help but feel the undercurrent of something far more sinister. The conversation buzzed around her, but it all seemed like background noise as her sharp eyes and ears honed in on the subtle signs of distress. The moment she had been dreading arrived when the announcement came that dinner was to be served. As the guests shuffled into the dining room, she noticed Miss Juliet whispering urgently to Edward Faulkner, her words too soft to catch, but the expression on Faulkner's face, tense, nervous, spoke volumes. Miss Marple, ever the observer, knew there was something between them, something hidden beneath the layers of propriety. Dinner itself was a grand affair, with silver platters and crystal goblets glittering in the soft candlelight. But even the lavish spread couldn't distract Miss Marple from the subtle exchanges around the table. Lord Foxglove, sitting at the head, barely touched his food, his gaze lingering too long on his daughter's anxious face. The older woman beside him, Mrs. Clements, fidgeted with her napkin, casting furtive glances toward the door as if expecting someone to arrive. Then, of course, there was the matter of the missing guest, the one everyone seemed to avoid mentioning. Richard McKenna, the charming but unreliable nephew, was nowhere to be found, despite being expected at the dinner. Miss Juliet had claimed he was delayed, but even her typically composed demeanor faltered when questioned. The evening carried on with strained pleasantries, but the truth was, Miss Marple knew there was something more to the quiet that lingered in the house. Something beyond the whispers of relatives who had long been accustomed to one another's ways. The truth had a habit of hiding in plain sight, tucked away beneath layers of smiles and false assurances. It was only a matter of time before the mask slipped, and when it did, Miss Marple would be ready. As the clock ticked towards midnight, the wind howled against the windows, rattling the old panes. Miss Marple, sitting back in her chair, could feel the moment of truth approaching, like the calm before a storm. The answer, she was certain, lay somewhere in the history of Foxglove Hall itself, the secrets buried deep within its walls, waiting to be unearthed. Mrs. Dalloway had mentioned something else, something that had unsettled her even further. The hall had always been known for its Christmas parties, but this year there was a palpable sense of unease. The staff had been asked to leave early, and the usual Christmas Eve festivities had been reduced to a quiet dinner with only family and a few select guests. It was not the sort of event one would expect from a family with such high social standing. Miss Marple's instincts were telling her that the story of Foxglove Hall's Christmas was only beginning to unfold, and the pieces of the puzzle were scattered in front of her, waiting to be assembled. As the evening stretched on and the house settled into silence, she stood and moved toward the grand staircase, the creak of the floorboards echoing in the stillness. She'd only just begun to scratch the surface of what was truly happening in this house, and whatever the Foxglove family was hiding, Miss Marple knew she would get to the bottom of it, no matter the cost. Her mind raced with the questions that needed answers, the connections she needed to make. There was a shadow here, cast over Foxglove Hall, and no amount of festive cheer could disguise it. It was time for the family's secrets to come to light. The next morning arrived with a cold, grey light, the kind that makes the shadows seem deeper and the silence more profound. Foxglove Hall stood as still as a monument, its stone walls unmoved by the fresh layer of snow that covered the grounds. Miss Marple rose early, as was her habit, and made her way downstairs. The house was still and quiet, the usual hum of servants and guests absent, replaced only by the crackle of the fire in the hearth. The morning had not begun well, with Mrs. Dalloway clearly upset as she handed Miss Marple a letter. It was addressed to Lord Foxglove, though it seemed hastily written. The handwriting was messy, rushed even, and there was something odd about the way the words were formed. Miss Marple noted that the letter had clearly been opened before, the flap slightly crumpled. Lord Foxglove had been looking for it, she learned, though there was no indication of why. The morning passed with the usual festive bustle of the holidays, though Miss Marple could feel the undercurrent of something darker beneath it all. The family seemed unusually distant. Juliet, still anxious after the night before, had taken to pacing the long halls of the manor, and her eyes darted constantly to the door as though expecting someone to arrive, though, of course, no one did. Her father, Lord Foxglove, continued to be uncharacteristically withdrawn, his brow furrowed as he spoke in clipped tones with his lawyer, Edward Faulkner. Every word seemed measured, carefully chosen, as though some part of him knew a storm was coming. By midday, the atmosphere in the house had thickened. The long table, set for a hearty Christmas feast, remained untouched. The only sound was the occasional clink of silverware being adjusted by the servants. Miss Marple's curiosity had deepened overnight, and now, with the quiet weight of the morning bearing down on her, she knew she had to take a closer look at the matter of Richard McKenna. The missing nephew had become more than a mere curiosity. It was now a key part of the puzzle. His absence from dinner, his unexplained delay, and the tension that seemed to follow his name, all of it pointed toward something unsettling. After a brief conversation with Mrs. Dalloway, Miss Marple made her way to the study. The room was lined with heavy mahogany bookshelves, and a large ornate desk stood in the center, its surface cluttered with papers. Lord Foxglove sat behind it, the lines of his face deepening with age and worry. He looked up as Miss Marple entered, his expression stiff but not unfriendly. "I trust you are finding the house to your liking, Miss Marple," he asked, though his tone was more polite formality than genuine interest. "I find it quite impressive, Lord Foxglove," she replied, her eyes scanning the room. She didn't trust the polite gestures, the surface-level interactions. It was always the quiet moments, when people weren't looking, that the truth often slipped out. "I need to speak with you about your nephew, Richard," she said, cutting to the heart of the matter. She watched his eyes flicker just for a moment, but it was enough to signal the eye reaction she was hoping for. His grip on the papers tightened, and for the first time, he looked at her with something more than measured politeness. There was caution in his gaze. I'm afraid Richard has a complicated nature, Lord Foxglove said slowly, carefully choosing his words. He's not one to follow schedules or plans, Miss Marple. It's in his character to wander off when he pleases. But not this time, Miss Marple pressed, her voice gentle but firm. Lord Foxglove exhaled sharply, running a hand through his graying hair. Not this time, he muttered, almost to himself. He looked at her, then, as if reconsidering, "You should know, Miss Marple, that Richard was not well liked in the family. His habits, well, they've often been a source of tension. There were—" He hesitated, as though weighing the consequences of his words. "There were disagreements, not just with me, but with others." "Others?" Miss Marple repeated, her gaze sharp. Now, all pretense of politeness gone. "Yes, others. Juliet, for one, and Edward Faulkner, the lawyer. I imagine you've noticed the tension in the house. It's not entirely unwarranted." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, then pressed him further. "What kind of disagreements?" Lord Foxglove shifted in his chair, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. "I won't deny that Richard was a problem. He was reckless, impulsive, and frankly a burden to the family. But I didn't expect it to go this far. He had his issues with money, with the inheritance." "Money?" Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "So this wasn't simply a family squabble?" Lord Foxglove's face darkened. "It was more than that, Miss Marple. Richard's behavior had put him at odds with the entire family, and the inheritance was the final straw. There was talk of him wanting a larger share, more than he was entitled to." Miss Marple studied him for a moment, piecing together the fragments. A missing nephew, family tensions, and money. Always money. It was the kind of situation that could easily spiral out of control. "Was Richard involved with anyone?" she asked suddenly, her voice calm but probing. Lord Foxglove's eyes narrowed. "Involved? In what way? Perhaps romantically? Or with someone outside the family?" He paused, and for a long moment Miss Marple wasn't sure if he would answer. Then, with a quiet sigh, he spoke. "There was someone. A woman. I never approved of her. Her name was Margaret. I believe she was one of Richard's more questionable associates." "Margaret." Miss Marple repeated the name, tasting it, running it through her mind. She was certain this was not the last she would hear of it. Before she could ask more, the study door swung open, and Edward Faulkner entered, his face as pale as the light outside. "Lord Foxglove, there's been a development," he said, his voice shaking with urgency. Miss Marple turned to the lawyer, sensing that the quiet house was about to reveal yet another layer of its secrets. Edward Faulkner's entrance was nothing short of dramatic, his face drawn and pale, his normally composed demeanor now crumbling beneath the weight of something urgent. He moved swiftly across the room, his shoes tapping sharply against the polished floors, but there was an unmistakable unease in his movements. The moment his gaze met Miss Marple's, she could tell something had shifted, something that would break the careful facade that had been maintained in Foxglove Hall for so long. "I'm afraid it's about Richard," Faulkner said, his voice low and edged with an undercurrent of panic. He paused as if searching for the right words, but they didn't come easily. Lord Foxglove, who had been watching him intently, seemed to brace himself, his already tense posture stiffening further. "What happened?" Lord Foxglove asked, his tone harsh with barely contained worry. Faulkner took a deep breath, clearly struggling to maintain his composure. "We've found his car, sir. It's been abandoned just outside the woods, by the old stone bridge." Lord Foxglove's face tightened, and he let out a low curse under his breath. "So he's been out there, in the storm?" "I don't know," Faulkner said, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted his glasses. "The car was locked. There was no sign of him, but there's something else." Miss Marple leaned forward in her chair, her eyes narrowing as she absorbed the implications of Faulkner's words. The snowstorm the night before had been fierce, and if Richard had been out there, in the middle of it, the odds of him being unharmed seemed slim. But it was the something else that intrigued her, that hint of unease that Faulkner couldn't quite hide. "What else?" she asked, her voice steady but insistent. Faulkner hesitated for a moment, glancing quickly at Lord Foxglove as though seeking permission to continue. When Foxglove gave a curt nod, Faulkner spoke again, his words coming out in a rush. "We found a message, Miss Marple, written in the snow near the car. It wasn't much, just a few words, but it was clear enough. It said, 'Meet me where it all began.'" The words hung in the air like an echo of something forgotten, something buried beneath the surface of the family's history. Miss Marple's mind began to race, her thoughts snapping into place like the gears of a well-oiled machine. "Where it all began," she repeated softly, her gaze flicking from Faulkner to Lord Foxglove, whose expression had darkened considerably. "I assume you know where that is?" Miss Marple asked, though she already suspected the answer. Lord Foxglove nodded grimly. "Yes, it's the old chapel, the one on the far side of the property. It was important to the family once, a long time ago." The old chapel. Miss Marple's thoughts shifted again, this time to the history of the estate, to the long-buried secrets that had been hidden for generations. The Foxglove family had always been known for its wealth, its prominence in society, but there had been whispers about its past, whispers that Miss Marple had heard, though she had never given them much credence. There had always been talk of a scandal, something that had occurred at the chapel, something that had left a stain on the family's name. "Do you think Richard went there?" Miss Marple asked, her voice calm, though her mind was anything but. The chapel had always been off-limits to the staff, a relic of a bygone era that no one spoke of. But now, with Richard's strange message, it seemed that the past was forcing its way back into the present. "I don't know," Faulkner said, running a hand through his thinning hair. "But it's the only place that makes sense. The chapel, it holds a certain significance, you see. For Richard, for all of us." Lord Foxglove cleared his throat, his gaze shifting away from Miss Marple. "It's a place of memories," he said, his voice low as if speaking of something painful. "It was where the family, where I—" He stopped himself, the words too heavy to continue. Miss Marple watched him closely, noting the slight tremor in his hand as he reached for a brandy glass on the side table. The tension in the room was palpable, and the more she learned, the more the pieces seemed to fall into place, but there was still so much she didn't understand. The chapel, Richard's message, the odd fractured history of the family. "Lord Foxglove," Miss Marple said gently, her voice unwavering. "What happened at the chapel all those years ago?" Foxglove froze, his fingers tightening around the glass, as if the very question had caught him off guard. He glanced at Faulkner, who seemed to shrink back slightly, as though expecting the question but unsure of how to answer it. Lord Foxglove began, his voice strained. "It's not something I like to talk about. It's a painful chapter." "Painful or not," Miss Marple interjected softly, "it's a chapter that seems to hold the answers to the mystery at hand." Foxglove looked at her then, his expression conflicted, torn between his pride and the weight of the truth that had been buried for so long. Finally, with a resigned sigh, he placed the glass down with a quiet clink and met her gaze. "It was about my brother," he said quietly. "My younger brother, Geoffrey. He died, Miss Marple, and it was no accident. The chapel, it's where it happened." The air in the room grew thick with the unspoken history, and Miss Marple's heart quickened. She had known, in some way, that the past was tangled with the present, but this revelation brought it all into sharper focus. A death, a family secret, a brother who had been lost and perhaps never truly found. "I see," Miss Marple said softly, her mind racing. "And Richard?" Foxglove's expression darkened further, his eyes shadowed with years of guilt and grief. Richard always wanted to know the truth about Geoffrey's death. And He stopped again, his voice faltering as if the weight of the confession was almost too much to bear. I didn't want him to find out. Miss Marple's thoughts swirled with the implications. Richard, the rebellious nephew, the chapel, the mysterious message in the snow, it all pointed towards something buried beneath the family's surface, a tragedy that had been hidden for far too long. As the weight of the moment settled between them, Miss Marple knew that the truth was within her grasp. All she had to do now was follow the trail that had been laid before her, and the first step, she knew, was to find the chapel where everything, past and present, would finally come to light. The chapel stood at the farthest edge of the estate, hidden away from the main house by dense woods that had grown untamed over the years. The path leading to it was overgrown, and even in the daylight, the shadows seemed to stretch long and unnaturally. The trees, gnarled and ancient, arched overhead, their twisted limbs blocking out much of the weak winter sun. It was as if the world itself had conspired to keep the chapel buried in secrecy. Miss Marple walked slowly along the path, her breath forming small clouds in the frosty air. The crunch of snow beneath her feet was the only sound, breaking the eerie stillness. She had asked Mrs. Dalloway to prepare a small bundle of provisions in case she needed them, though her instincts told her that this wasn't going to be a simple exploration. There was something unsettling about the place, something that felt as though it had been waiting for her. When she reached the chapel, she paused for a moment to take it all in. It was a small stone building, its once pristine facade now weathered by the ravages of time. The ivy had long ago claimed the walls, creeping up in twisted tendrils, clinging to the sides like some living entity. The windows were covered in grime, their stained glass long since faded and cracked. But despite its dilapidated appearance, there was a strange kind of reverence in the air, as though the chapel itself held the weight of its history in its crumbling walls. Miss Marple stepped carefully up to the heavy wooden doors, their edges worn smooth from years of use. The door creaked ominously as she pushed it open, the sound echoing through the empty space inside. The chapel was cold, much colder than the outside air, as if it had been untouched for decades. The faint scent of mildew lingered in the air, mixing with the unmistakable smell of old stone and dust. As her eyes adjusted to the dim light, she could make out the outlines of old pews, their wood long since rotted. The altar stood at the far end of the room, its once beautiful carvings now faded and chipped. But it was not the state of the chapel that caught her attention. It was the unmistakable presence of something else. A sense of tension, like a string pulled too tight, hung in the air. She could almost hear the whispers of the past echoing in the silence, the footsteps of those who had walked here before, and the weight of the tragedy that had unfolded in this very place. Miss Marple's gaze moved to the floor, where a small patch of the stone had been worn smooth, as though it had been trodden upon for years. There was something about it that seemed deliberate, as if someone had been trying to erase something, to hide it beneath the years of neglect. She knelt down, her fingers brushing lightly over the cold stone, feeling for any trace of the past that might have been left behind. Her fingers stopped abruptly as she felt a small indentation, barely perceptible beneath the dirt and grime. She wiped the surface away carefully, revealing the faint outline of a name, etched into the stone itself. "Geoffrey," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the stillness. It was as if the name itself had been waiting for her to uncover it, to reveal the truth that had been buried here for so long. Miss Marple's heart quickened, but she did not allow herself to be swept up in the emotion of the discovery. There was still so much to learn, so many questions left unanswered. She stood, her eyes scanning the chapel once more, as though expecting to find something more. As she turned to leave, a rustling sound from the corner of the room caught her attention. She froze, her senses immediately alert. For a moment, she thought she had imagined it, but then she heard it again, soft, almost imperceptible, like the flutter of a cloth. She moved cautiously toward the source of the sound, her eyes scanning the shadows. It was then that she saw it, a small, tattered curtain drawn across the farthest corner of the chapel. The fabric was so worn that it barely clung to. Its rod and the edges seemed frayed, as though someone had used it far too often. Miss Marple reached for the curtain, her fingers trembling slightly as she drew it aside. Behind it was a narrow door, so small and unobtrusive that she had missed it at first. It was old, the wood warped and cracked, but it was clearly still functional. She hesitated for only a moment before pushing it open. The door creaked loudly in the stillness, the sound reverberating in the quiet chapel as though it, too, were protesting the intrusion. Beyond the door was a small room, no larger than a cupboard. It was dark and musty, the air thick with dust and the scent of old wood. The only light came from a small crack in the stone wall, where a few rays of sunlight struggled to break through. As Miss Marple stepped inside, her eyes were immediately drawn to the far corner of the room where a small chest sat. It was a simple thing, old and unremarkable, but there was something about it that seemed out of place in this forgotten corner. She approached it slowly, her heart beating a little faster as she knelt beside it. The chest was locked, but the lock was old, its metal tarnished and corroded with age. Miss Marple ran her fingers over the surface, feeling for any sign of a key or a mechanism. Then, with a soft click, the lock gave way, and the chest opened with a groan of protest. Inside, there were a few scattered papers, their edges yellowed with age. Miss Marple sifted through them carefully, her fingers brushing over the brittle pages. As she read, her eyes widened in shock. The papers were letters, old correspondence that had been hidden away for decades. They were written in a hurried, frantic hand, the ink smudged in places as though the writer had been in a hurry to finish. Miss Marple's heart raced as she read the words that had been left behind. The letters spoke of a family secret, one so dark and terrible that it had been buried here in the chapel for years. A secret about Geoffrey Foxglove, Lord Foxglove's brother, and his death. It was not an accident, as they had all been told. It was murder. The realization hit her like a wave. Everything, the chapel, the strange messages, the family's reluctance to speak of the past, had been building toward this moment. The truth was here, hidden in the shadows, waiting to be uncovered. And now, Miss Marple knew what she had to do. The Foxglove family's darkest secret was finally about to be revealed. The chill of the chapel had settled deep into Miss Marple's bones as she carefully folded the letters and returned them to the chest. She had uncovered enough, perhaps more than enough, to know that the Foxglove family's history was far darker than anyone had imagined. But the answers were still fragmented, as though pieces of a puzzle had been scattered across the estate, and only by connecting them could the whole picture emerge. As she left the hidden room and stepped back into the main chapel, the weight of the past seemed to press in on her from all sides. The chapel, cold and abandoned as it was, had once been the site of something far more alive, something tragic, but also something terribly secret. Geoffrey Foxglove had been killed here, murdered. And that act, so long ago, had cast a shadow that still hung heavily over the entire family. Miss Marple's mind raced as she retraced her steps back to the main house. The letters had been clear in their implications. Geoffrey's death had not been an accident, as Lord Foxglove had insisted, but something far more deliberate. The family had been living with the guilt and shame of it for years, and yet none of them seemed willing to confront the truth. Why? And more importantly, who had been responsible? The house greeted her with its usual silence. The Christmas decorations, still in place, seemed to mock the gravity of what she had just uncovered. She paused in the hall, feeling the weight of the walls around her, as if the house itself were holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable. Miss Marple knew the family was hiding something, but the question now was, which one of them had the most to lose from the truth coming to light? She found Lord Foxglove in his study, sitting by the fire, his fingers drumming restlessly on the arm of his chair. He didn't look up as she entered, but there was an unmistakable tension in his posture that suggested he knew she had been to the chapel. "I trust you've had a good look around?" he asked, his voice devoid of warmth. "I have," Miss Marple replied, her voice steady but filled with quiet resolve. "And I think I now understand why your family has gone to such lengths to keep the past hidden." Lord Foxglove's eyes flickered briefly, but he said nothing, his gaze fixed on the fire. "You've been living with the guilt of your brother's death for many years," Miss Marple continued. "But the truth is, Geoffrey's death was not an accident. It was murder." The words hung between them like an accusation, and Lord Foxglove stiffened as though he had been struck. His silence was deafening. Miss Marple stepped closer, her eyes never leaving his. "You know I'm right," she said softly. "You've spent your life protecting a secret, but it's time for the truth to come out." Lord Foxglove took a deep breath, his face hardening. "And what exactly do you think you know, Miss Marple? What makes you so certain of your conclusions?" Miss Marple's gaze was unwavering. "The letters, the ones I found in the chapel. Geoffrey wrote them before his death. He was trying to expose what had happened, but he never had the chance." At the mention of the letters, Lord Foxglove's face drained of color. For a long moment, he said nothing, his eyes distant as though he were reliving a painful memory. Then, slowly, he looked up at her. "You don't understand," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Geoffrey, he was going to ruin everything. The family, our legacy. It would all have been destroyed, and he knew it. He had to be stopped." "Stopped?" Miss Marple repeated, her voice sharp with disbelief. "You mean murdered?" Foxglove's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, he looked like a man cornered, desperate to defend himself. "It wasn't supposed to happen like that," he muttered, more to himself than to Miss Marple. "We tried to reason with him. He wouldn't listen. He was out of control. He wanted more. He wanted everything." "More?" Miss Marple echoed. "What exactly was he after, Lord Foxglove?" He took another deep breath, his shoulders slumping. "Money, power, all of it. He wanted the family fortune, the land, everything we had built. And the worst part was, he didn't care how he got it. He was willing to destroy us all." "Is that what you told yourself?" Miss Marple asked, her voice soft but probing. "That he had to be stopped? Because he was dangerous?" Lord Foxglove looked at her then, his eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and defiance. "It's the truth," he said, though the words came out with the hollow sound of a man trying to justify an action he knew could never be excused. "Geoffrey was reckless. He didn't care about the consequences. I thought it would be better to end it before he could destroy us all." Miss Marple stood quietly, allowing the silence to stretch between them. It was clear now that the family had been living in the shadow of this terrible truth for far too long. But what was even more evident was that Lord Foxglove had been complicit in something that could never be undone. "So you killed him," Miss Marple said, her voice steady but filled with quiet reproach. "You killed your brother to protect your family's wealth. You silenced him, just as you've tried to silence the truth for all these years." Lord Foxglove's face twisted in a mixture of sorrow and anger, but he did not deny it. "Yes," he said quietly, almost as though the admission had been tearing him apart. "I had no choice. None of us did." Miss Marple's eyes softened, but there was no pity in her gaze. She had seen too much in her life to feel anything but sorrow for a family torn apart by greed and betrayal. But she also knew that the truth had to be faced, no matter how painful. "You did have a choice," she replied, her voice firm. "But now, your family must live with the consequences of your actions." Lord Foxglove sat back in his chair, his face crumpled in despair. The fire flickered in the hearth, casting long shadows across the room, but there was no warmth left in the air. The secret had been exposed, and now there would be no hiding from it. The truth had come to light, and there was no going back. The Foxglove family's legacy, once built on wealth and power, had been irrevocably shattered by the choices of one man, and consequences of those choices would ripple through generations to come. The morning after Lord Foxglove's confession was heavier than the last. The estate, once so alive with the hum of Christmas festivities, now felt like a mausoleum, the air thick with an unspoken grief that permeated every corner of the house. Miss Marple could sense the tension even before she left her room. Something was stirring beneath the surface, and she knew it was not just the shock of the previous night's revelations. The family was fracturing, each member seemingly locked in their own world of guilt and remorse. But it was time for everything to come to light. She made her way downstairs, the house eerily quiet except for the occasional creak of the floorboards underfoot. As she passed the grand staircase, she saw Miss Juliet Foxglove standing at the foot of it, her face pale and drawn. There were circles under her eyes, but her expression was unreadable, as though she had not slept at all. She was, staring out of the window, her arms folded tightly over her chest, as if bracing herself for something. When Juliet finally turned to face her, Miss Marple was struck by the change in her demeanor. The haughty, distant woman who had arrived so full of pride and control seemed to have withered overnight. What was once a carefully constructed mask now appeared to be crumbling away, revealing a woman on the verge of collapse. "Miss Marple," Juliet said softly, her voice tremulous but still laced with the remnants of defiance. "You know, don't you?" Miss Marple nodded, her gaze steady. "Yes, I know." Juliet sighed, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of a lifetime. "All these years, we've lived with it, pretending it never happened. But the truth always finds a way to resurface, doesn't it?" Her eyes were filled with a sadness that Miss Marple knew was deeper than just the events of the past few days. Juliet had known about her father's involvement in Geoffrey's death for years, but she had never dared speak it aloud. The family's silence had been a bond that kept them united in their guilt and their shame. "You don't have to protect him anymore," Miss Marple said quietly, taking a step closer. Juliet's face twisted with a mix of frustration and sorrow. "You don't understand. He's my father. I've spent my whole life trying to protect him, trying to keep the family together, but the price of that, it's too high. The lies, the cover-ups. I thought I could live with it, but now it's all falling apart." Her voice cracked, and Miss Marple could see how much the weight of the truth had destroyed her. The facade of control, the indifference she had worn like armor, had shattered, leaving her raw and vulnerable. Miss Marple could almost hear the years of pent-up anguish in Juliet's words. "Sometimes, holding on to the truth is the only way to stop it from consuming you," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but firm. "You don't have to carry this burden alone." Juliet looked at her then, really looked at her, as if seeing her for the first time. For a moment, their eyes locked in an understanding that transcended the words between them. Then, as if a dam had broken, Juliet sank into a nearby chair, her face buried in her hands. The sobs came quietly at first, then louder, as if the years of silence had been waiting for this moment to escape. Miss Marple allowed her to grieve, knowing that sometimes the most important thing one could do was simply bear witness. After a long moment, Juliet's sobs quieted, and she lifted her head, her cheeks streaked with tears. She looked exhausted, as if the fight to hold everything in had finally drained her. "I always wondered why he never seemed to care," Juliet said, her voice small, almost a whisper. "He never apologized, not once. Not even after everything we've been through." "Some things are too painful to admit," Miss Marple replied softly, her heart aching for the daughter who had been left in the shadows of her father's sins. "Sometimes people don't know how to face their own guilt, and they make excuses to keep going, but that doesn't change the truth." "I never wanted to know the truth," Juliet said bitterly. "But I did. I always did. It's just the weight of it, the burden of knowing he killed Jeffrey. I can't stand it anymore." Miss Marple placed a hand on her shoulder, offering what little comfort she could. "You don't have to protect him any longer. The truth is out, and it will set you free, even if it doesn't change what's already been done." Juliet gave a short laugh, but it was without humor. "It's a bit late for freedom, don't you think?" "The truth doesn't work on a timetable," Miss Marple said quietly. "But it's never too late to make peace with it." The conversation lingered in the air between them, unspoken but understood. Juliet had been carrying the weight of her father's actions for so long that it had twisted her own sense of self. Now, the truth had come out, and there was no turning back. It was up to each member of the family to find their own way through the wreckage. As Miss Marple turned to leave the room, her thoughts still lingered on the unspoken history of the Foxglove family. What had begun as a simple murder mystery had unraveled into a far greater story, one of betrayal, guilt, and the consequences of buried secrets. Lord Foxglove had tried to shield his family from the truth, but in doing so, he had condemned them to live in its shadow for decades. In the days that followed, Miss Marple observed the Foxglove family in their final attempts to hold on to their crumbling legacy. Lord Foxglove, once so proud and domineering, seemed like a shadow of the man he had been. He walked the halls of his home as if he had lost all claim to it, his every step heavy with the weight of his actions. Juliet withdrew into herself, lost in the labyrinth of her emotions, her grief now matched only by her confusion. And yet, despite it all, Miss Marple knew that they would find a way forward. The truth had torn them apart, but it had also given them the opportunity to rebuild, piece by painful piece. Whether they could forgive themselves was another matter entirely, but for Miss Marple, that was never the most important question. The real answer lay in what they would do next. In the quiet aftermath of the storm, the choice to rebuild, to move forward, and to live with the consequences of their actions, that was where the true test would lie. As she left Foxglove Hall for the final time, Miss Marple glanced over her shoulder at the house that had borne so much pain. The shadows that had haunted its walls would never fully disappear, but perhaps, just perhaps, the family could learn to live in the light. The days following Miss Marple's final conversation with Juliet passed slowly, like a heavy fog rolling over the estate. The air around Foxglove Hall remained thick with the residue of old secrets, but the clarity that had come with the truth was undeniable. There was no longer any pretense of normalcy in the household. Lord Foxglove had retreated into his study, a place where he had once commanded authority, but now it was the very last refuge of a man who had lost his grip on everything he had built. Juliet, too, had become a shadow of herself, often found staring out of the window, her gaze lost in the endless expanse of snow. It was as if the weight of the past had claimed her entirely, leaving her unable to move forward. Her silence was as heavy as the snow itself, suffocating and oppressive. The household staff had been discreet in their duties, no longer the lively, engaged group they once were. They whispered in corners, casting furtive glances at each other and at their masters, aware that something irrevocable had transpired within these walls. Foxglove Hall, which had once stood as a monument to wealth and tradition, now felt like a house of mourning. Miss Marple had taken it upon herself to visit the family one last time, her purpose clear in her mind. She had already done what she came to do. She had uncovered the truth, but now it was time to leave them to their own devices. She had no more work to do, but she knew that the family would need more than just time to heal. She arrived at the house late in the morning, just as the sun was breaking through the thick cloud cover, casting pale light across the snow-covered grounds. The house was quiet when she entered, and as she made her way toward the study, she found herself wondering just how much had changed since she had first arrived. What had once seemed like a picturesque, grand home now felt like an eerie monument to the fragility of family and legacy. The study door was ajar, and she stepped inside without hesitation. Lord Foxglove was sitting at his desk, his back turned toward her, his shoulders hunched in a way that seemed to suggest a man far older than his years. His head was buried in his hands, as though he could no longer bear the weight of his own thoughts. "Lord Foxglove," Miss Marple said gently, her voice cutting through the stillness of the room. He looked up, but there was no recognition in his eyes, just a weariness that spoke of too many sleepless nights and too many regrets. "Miss Marple," he murmured, his voice distant. "I expected you would be the one to come. Not that it matters now." "Does anything matter anymore?" Miss Marple asked, her tone soft but laced with an underlying sense of truth. "It all depends on what you choose to do with the rest of your days, Lord Foxglove. You've made your choices, and now you must face the consequences." Lord Foxglove met her gaze, his eyes cloudy and distant. "Consequences," he repeated, as if the word held no meaning for him anymore. "What's left? To face, Miss Marple? My family is shattered. My legacy is in ruins. I have nothing." "You still have your conscience," Miss Marple replied, her voice unwavering. "And that, Lord Foxglove, is more than many people have when they've lived a life such as yours." He let out a bitter laugh, but it held no mirth. "A conscience, you say? It's a curse more than a gift. What good is a conscience when it condemns you to live with the choices you've made?" Miss Marple stepped closer, her eyes softening as she regarded him. "You can't undo what has been done, but you can make amends. Not to others, though that might help, but to yourself. You need to accept what you've done and make peace with it." Lord Foxglove didn't respond immediately, his gaze falling once more to the desk, where papers were scattered in disarray. It was as though the chaos of the room mirrored the chaos inside him. "I don't know how," he murmured. "You start by facing your family," Miss Marple said, her voice calm but firm. "By telling them the truth, truly telling them what happened. Not just in passing, not with half-truths. You owe them that much." He raised his eyes to hers, his expression filled with disbelief. "You want me to tell them everything? After all this time, after all we've been through, you really think that will heal anything?" "I don't know if it will heal anything," Miss Marple admitted, "but I know it will give them the chance to heal. There's a difference, you see, between trying to bury the past and giving it the space to breathe. You've been living with a lie for so long, Lord Foxglove, that you've forgotten what the truth feels like, but it's never too late to start again." His gaze lingered on her, and for a brief moment Miss Marple saw the vulnerability in his eyes. The man before her was not the confident Lord of Foxglove Hall who had ruled over his family with an iron fist. He was a broken man, someone who had allowed his pride and his fears to lead him down a path of destruction. But perhaps, just perhaps, there was still a chance for him to find his way back. "I've failed them," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I failed them all." Miss Marple nodded, her expression softening. "Yes, but you can still try to make things right. It will take time and it won't be easy, but it's possible. It starts with owning the truth, and from there you can begin to rebuild what has been broken." Lord Foxglove sat in silence, the weight of her words sinking in. He seemed to shrink before her eyes, a man who had once stood tall and proud, now facing the consequences of a lifetime of decisions. But there was something in his posture that suggested he was considering her words. Perhaps, just perhaps, he was finally ready to listen. "I'll try," he said quietly, his voice steadying. "I'll try." Miss Marple turned to leave. her mind already moving on to the next task, but she paused at the door. "That's all anyone can ask of you," she said softly. "The rest is in your hands." And with that, she left the study, leaving Lord Foxglove to face the hardest truth of all, that it was not too late to change, but the path forward would be a long and difficult one. The house, still standing tall and proud, seemed to hold its breath as the past and future collided within its walls. The truth had finally been spoken, and now it was up to the Foxglove family to decide what they would do with it. The morning was still and cold, the sky a pale shade of gray that hinted at the coming of another snowstorm. Foxglove Hall seemed almost too quiet, the usual hum of family life replaced by a heavy, oppressive silence. In the wake of the revelations, the house had become a place of strained stillness where every room seemed to echo with the weight of its own secrets. Lord Foxglove had kept to himself for the better part of the day, retreating into the sanctuary of his study where the walls seemed to offer him some semblance of protection from the outside world. Miss Marple had seen him there, hours earlier, his face worn and tired as he stared at the papers scattered before him. It was clear that he was still wrestling with the implications of his actions, struggling to find a way to move forward. But it was not just Lord Foxglove who was burdened with the past. Juliet, too, had become even more withdrawn, her grief now mingled with the confusion of what to do next. The family was fractured, each member locked in their own version of the truth, unable to bridge the gap between what had been and what could still be. But there was something in the air that day, something that told Miss Marple that the truth had not yet run its course. As she made her way through the house, she could feel the tension thickening, like the calm before a storm. She had spent enough time in places like this to know that the final act was often the most dangerous and the most revealing. She found Juliet sitting in the drawing room, staring blankly at the fire as the flames flickered and danced. The young woman's face was pale, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, but her eyes were distant, as though she were lost in a world of her own making. Miss Marple hesitated at the door, studying her for a moment before stepping inside. Juliet didn't seem to notice her approach, her attention entirely consumed by the hearth. "Miss Foxglove," Miss Marple said gently, though she could sense the heaviness in her voice. "How are you?" Juliet's eyes flickered toward her, but her expression remained unreadable. It was as if the question hadn't registered at first, or perhaps she simply didn't know how to answer it. "I'm not sure," Juliet replied at last, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what to feel anymore. Everything's changed." "That's understandable," Miss Marple said, her voice soft with empathy. "The truth has a way of doing that, but it doesn't have to mean the end. It can be a beginning if you choose to let it be." Juliet's gaze shifted back to the fire, her face shadowed in the dim light. "You don't know what it's like," she said quietly. "To live with a lie for so long, to keep it hidden, and then to see it all come crumbling down. I don't know how to face them, how to face him." "You start by facing yourself," Miss Marple replied, her voice steady but kind. "The rest will follow in time." For a long while, there was only silence between them, the crackle of the fire filling the void. Juliet's shoulders shook slightly, the only indication of the turmoil that churned beneath the surface. Miss Marple waited, allowing her the space to sort through her thoughts, knowing that sometimes the most important thing was simply to be present. Eventually, Juliet turned toward her, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I always thought I could protect him," she said, her voice trembling. "But now, I've failed. I couldn't protect him from the truth, and I couldn't protect myself either." "You didn't fail, Miss Foxglove," Miss Marple said gently. "You were doing what you thought was right, given the circumstances. But now, you have the chance to choose differently. The truth is never easy, but it's the only way forward." Juliet's expression flickered, a mixture of doubt and uncertainty passing across her face. And what if the truth destroys everything? What if it's too late to fix what's been broken? Miss Marple regarded her carefully, her eyes soft with understanding. The truth doesn't destroy, Miss Foxglove. It's what happens after the truth is revealed that shapes what comes next. You have the power to decide what that is. It may be difficult, but it's not the end unless you allow it to be. Juliet looked at her for a long moment, as if weighing her words. Then, slowly, she stood and walked to the window, her gaze fixed on the view of the estate beyond. The snow had started to fall again, thick, heavy flakes that blurred the world outside. It was beautiful, in a way, like a clean slate, a chance to start fresh. "I never wanted to be like him," Juliet said, her voice quiet but resolute. "But I've spent my whole life trying to live up to his expectations, to protect him. I don't know who I am without him." Miss Marple walked to the window and stood beside her, her eyes following Juliet's gaze. "You are someone who has lived through difficult things, someone who has seen the cost of silence and deceit, but that doesn't define you. What defines you is what you choose to do with this moment." Juliet's eyes filled with tears, but she did not look away from the snow. "And what if I can't change anything? What if it's already too late?" "It's never too late," Miss Marple replied firmly. "You have a choice, just like everyone else. The past can't be undone, but you can choose what happens next." For the first time, Juliet seemed to take a deep breath, as though something inside her had shifted. She didn't speak immediately, but the way she stood now, slightly more upright, the tension in her shoulders easing, spoke volumes. "I'll speak to him," she said quietly. "To my father. I don't know what I'll say, but I have to. For myself, for everyone." Miss Marple nodded, her heart swelling with quiet pride. "That is a brave thing to do, Miss Foxglove. It won't be easy, but it's the right thing." Juliet nodded slowly, then looked up at Miss Marple, her expression more composed than it had been in days. "Thank you," she said softly, "for reminding me that it's not too late." Miss Marple smiled warmly. "It's never too late to start again, Miss Foxglove. You've only just begun." As Miss Marple left the drawing room, the sense of calm that had settled over Juliet lingered in the air, like the first breath of spring after a long, harsh winter. The road ahead would be difficult, but it was theirs to walk. And for the first time, Juliet seemed ready to face it, not as a daughter seeking to protect her father's legacy, but as a woman determined to build her own. The days following Juliet's decision to confront her father were marked by an unsettling quiet. The house seemed to hold its breath, as though anticipating something profound, something inevitable that was about to unfold. Foxglove Hall, once so full of grandeur and pride, now stood as a shadow of itself, the air heavy with regret and the weight of unresolved truths. The family had scattered to their corners, each of them locked in their own private battle with the past, unsure of how to move forward or whether it was even possible. Lord Foxglove had not ventured far from his study. Juliet, too, seemed to have retreated into herself once again, though there was something different about her now. The walls she had carefully built over the years to protect herself from the painful reality of her family's secrets had begun to crumble, and with each passing day, she appeared less the distant, cold figure she once was, and more like someone awakening from a long, exhausting sleep. She had begun to speak with the staff, offering them kind words and small gestures of appreciation, and Miss Marple had noticed the slight shift in her demeanor. There was a new sense of resolve in her step, though it was tempered with a quiet sadness. It was a Wednesday morning when Juliet finally sought out her father. She had spent the better part of the previous night contemplating what to say, how to begin the conversation that had haunted her for years. The thought of confronting her father, of finally acknowledging the truth, had seemed insurmountable, But now she felt an unfamiliar sense of determination. She knew that if she was ever going to free herself from the suffocating grip of the past, she had to take this step. The study door was slightly ajar when she approached, and she paused for a moment before entering, her heart pounding in her chest. She had always been able to sense her father's presence, even when he wasn't in the room, and now, as she stood on the threshold, she could almost feel the weight of his gaze on her, even though he was looking down at some papers. His shoulders were slumped, his posture defeated, and for the first time in her life, Juliet saw him as something more than the imposing figure he had always been. He was just a man who had failed, and who now, at long last, had to face the consequences. "Father," Juliet said softly, her voice almost tentative. "Can we talk?" Lord Foxglove looked up slowly, his eyes narrowing for a brief moment as though unsure whether he had heard her correctly. For a long second, neither of them spoke. The air was thick with the tension of all the years that had come before, with everything they had avoided. Finally, he nodded, and she stepped into the room, closing the door softly behind her. "Of course, Juliet," he said, his voice weary but resigned, as though he had been expecting this moment for some time. She took a deep breath and walked toward him, but the distance between them felt far greater than the few feet that separated them. She had never known how to bridge the gap that existed between them, and now, as she stood before him, it felt as though the chasm between them had only grown wider. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice quivering slightly, "about everything. About Geoffrey, about what happened, and about you." Lord Foxglove didn't say anything, but his eyes dropped to his hands, his fingers twisting together in a nervous gesture that Juliet had never seen from him before. He was clearly struggling with something, perhaps with what he had done, or with the reality that his daughter had finally uncovered. The truth. "Juliet, he began, but she raised her hand, silencing him. "I'm not here to hear excuses," she said, her voice stronger now, though there was still a tremor in it. "I'm not here to make you feel better. I'm here because I need to hear you say it. I need to hear you admit what you did. To Geoffrey, to all of us." His face paled, and for a moment it seemed as if he might break. But then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he stood up from his chair. There was something different in his posture now. Not defiance, but an acceptance of what was coming. The proud man who had once ruled this house with an iron fist seemed to shrink before her, and she could see the weight of years of guilt and remorse bearing down on him. "I did it," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I killed Geoffrey. I thought I had no choice. He was going to destroy everything we had, everything we had built. I thought it was for the good of the family, but I was wrong. I was so wrong." The words hung in the air like a death sentence, the silence that followed stretching out between them. Juliet's heart pounded in her chest, her thoughts spinning as the reality of his confession sank in. She had known the truth all along, but hearing it from him, hearing him admit it so plainly, was something she hadn't been prepared for. The man who had been both her father and her tormentor was now a man who had destroyed everything for the sake of power and pride. The weight of it was almost too much to bear. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness," he continued, his voice raw with emotion. "I've failed you, Juliet. I've failed all of you, and I don't know how to make up for what I've done." Juliet stood there for a long time, her chest tightening with the rush of conflicting emotions that surged through her. Anger, betrayal, pain. They all swirled inside her, but there was something else, something deeper that she couldn't quite grasp. She had wanted the truth, but now that it was here, it felt like a burden she hadn't known how to carry. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft but firm. "You can't fix it, Father. You can't undo what you've done. But maybe we can stop pretending. Maybe we can finally start living with the truth." Lord Foxglove's face crumpled, the tears he had been holding back now spilling freely. He reached out for her, his hands trembling, but Juliet stepped back slightly, unsure whether she was ready to accept his touch. "You've ruined everything, Father," she said, her voice breaking. "But I still have to try. For myself, for my own peace. I have to move on." He nodded, his face etched with sorrow. "I understand, Juliet, and I will live with this guilt for the rest of my life." They stood in silence, the weight of everything between them almost suffocating. But for the first time in years, Juliet felt a flicker of something. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the possibility of release. The past had been a prison, but perhaps, just perhaps, it could finally be left behind. "I'll speak to the others," she said, her voice steadying. "But not today. Not yet." Lord Foxglove nodded once more, his shoulders sagging under the weight of his confession. The truth had been spoken, and now the hard work of healing, if it were even possible, had to begin. The days that followed Juliet's confrontation with her father marked the beginning of a long and painful journey for the Foxglove family. Each day seemed to bring a fresh wave of quiet grief, but there was something else too. A tentative hope, fragile but real. It was as though the house itself, once so heavy with secrets and guilt, was breathing again, exhaling the stale air that had built up over the years. For the first time in decades, the family was forced to face the truth, not just about Geoffrey's death, but about the lies they had built their lives on. Miss Marple watched all of this from the sidelines, her presence always discreet, but still ever vigilant. She had done what she had come to do. She had unearthed the truth, laid bare the family's darkest secret, and helped them begin the process of reconciliation. But now, as she prepared to leave Foxglove Hall, she felt an uncharacteristic sense of satisfaction. The case was over, not because the truth had been fully embraced, but because the family had begun to move toward healing. And for Miss Marple, that was enough. It was the morning of her departure, when Lord Foxglove finally sought her out. He found her sitting in the drawing room, sipping tea as she prepared to leave for the train station. The room was quieter than usual, the only sound the distant creak of the old house settling under the weight of the snow that had been falling all night. "Miss Marple," Lord Foxglove said, his voice rough, but there was a new strength in it. His posture had changed, no longer the broken figure of the man who had admitted his crime, but something more resolute, as though he had made peace with the past, at least in part. "I wanted to thank you." She looked up from her tea, her eyes soft but knowing. "You don't need to thank me, Lord Foxglove. I merely did what I always do, follow the clues and let the truth reveal itself." He sat down across from her, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "But it was more than that. You did something we hadn't been able to do for years. You helped us see the truth. You helped me see it, and for that, I will be forever grateful." She smiled faintly, but her gaze was steady. The truth is often the hardest thing to face, but it's the only way to move forward. You've made a start, Lord Foxglove. The rest will come in time. Lord Foxglove's face softened, his eyes briefly closing as if the weight of it all had finally settled in his chest. "I don't know what to say to Juliet. I don't know how to make it right." Miss Marple took a deep breath and set her teacup down. "The first step is already done. You've admitted your wrongs, and that is no small thing. Now you must let Juliet find her own way. She's not the same person she was before, and neither are you. It's going to take time for her to heal, just as it will for you. But if you both remain honest with each other, there is a chance for peace." Lord Foxglove nodded slowly, the years of arrogance and pride still lingering in the way he carried himself. But there was a humility in his gaze now, a humility that had been missing for so long. "I'll do whatever it takes to make things right, Miss Marple. For her, for all of us." She stood, her hands clasped neatly in front of her. "You'll do just fine, Lord Foxglove. But remember, change doesn't happen overnight. It's a slow process, and there will be days when it seems too hard to bear, but you've already started. You've taken the hardest step." He rose as well, a quiet gratitude in his eyes. "I won't forget what you've done for us. I hope you know that." "I do," she replied with a soft smile. "But I've done nothing more than point the way. It's up to you now to walk it." As Miss Marple walked toward the door, she paused one last time, her gaze lingering on the familiar surroundings of Foxglove Hall. She had seen many families come and go, and most were never able to fully heal from the wounds of the past. But something about this place, something about Lord Foxglove and Juliet, told her that they might be the exception. The sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway, and Miss Marple turned to find Juliet approaching. Her face was still pale, but there was a calmness in her expression that hadn't been there before. She looked more like herself, no longer the distant woman who had hidden behind the walls of the past, but someone who had finally stepped out into the light, even if only just a little. "Miss Marple," Juliet said, her voice steady but filled with a new quiet strength. "I wanted to thank you too." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow, a soft smile playing at the corners of her lips. "For what?" "For helping me see the truth," Juliet replied. "For showing me that I could face it. I don't know what the future holds, but I know I'm ready to face it now. I couldn't have done it without you." Miss Marple nodded, a knowing look in her eyes. "The truth was always within you, Miss Foxglove. You just had to let yourself see it. I'm glad you did." Juliet stepped forward, hesitating for a moment before extending her hand. Miss Marple took it, the gesture simple but full of meaning. For the first time in a long while, Juliet seemed at peace with herself. She had faced the truth, had forgiven her father, and was beginning to forgive herself. "Goodbye, Miss Marple," Juliet said softly, her voice now full of something that had been missing for so long. Hope. "Goodbye, Miss Foxglove," Miss Marple replied, her gaze lingering for a moment before she turned and walked out of the room. The truth had been spoken, the past had been acknowledged, and now it was time for both of them to move on. As she stepped out into the cold, the snow falling gently around her, Miss Marple felt a quiet satisfaction. The case was over, but the family's story was just beginning. They had been given a chance to rebuild, and though the road ahead would be long and difficult, they had one thing they hadn't had before: the truth. She glanced back at Foxglove Hall, its silhouette fading in the distance, and for the first time in a long while, she felt certain that this family, fractured as they were, had a chance at healing. The truth had set them on that path. Now it was up to them to walk it. And with that, Miss Marple continued on her way, knowing that, as always, the answers were never as simple as they seemed, but the journey was always worth it.